All
So,
righty. Well, it's top of the hour, and welcome everyone to Braille Literacy's Canada um, eBraille webinar. Thank you for joining us, and I'm Daphne Hitchcock, President of Braille Literacy Canada, and I'm going to pop the mic over to Kim Kilpatrick, our Vice President. Kim, take it away, please.
good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are coming from. My name is Kim Kilpatrick. As Daphne said, I'm Vice President of Braille Literacy Canada. I want to thank everybody who publicized this so that we got the word out to have 216 people registered for this workshop. So we are very pleased about that. We know that this is a topic of great importance to everybody and excitement within our community. I know that you found us, so obviously you know a little bit, but Braille Literacy Canada, we are the Braille Authority in Canada, and we have a lot of programs and interesting workshops and materials and resources on our website, including past presentations from our annual Braille Symposium, which comes every year in the spring, late spring, early summer. We also hold a lot of World Braille days activities because we do it all month of January. We also have resources for people new to Braille and other things. So please feel free to keep checking our website. And thank you so much to everyone for coming. I'm going to quickly turn things over to our presenter, Willow Free. And Willow can introduce herself more if she feels like, but she does work at APH and is a Braille transcriber and has been very involved in the development of eBraille. So I'm very excited to turn things over to Willow. Welcome and thank you so very much.
Hi, yeah, thanks you all for having me for this presentation. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm really excited to go over this topic with you all. And yeah, my name's Willow Free. I've been at APH for 13 years. I started as a Braille transcriber and then moved into the technology side. And that was really where I found, I don't know, the like melding of my interests of like literacy and technology. So my focus has been on the Braille product side. So the Refresher Braille 18, Mantis, Chameleon, the Monarch, and that was also, and Braille Blaster. And then that was also what led me to be involved with eBraille. So I'm really excited, and I've got a PowerPoint, and I'm going to kind of walk through sort of the process of who and how eBraille was created, what the goals were. We'll get into some technical stuff. I think I've got it set up in a way that's like really easy to understand. And we're not, I'm not going to bore you with like the most technical details, but I think it's helpful when you think about eBraille to understand kind of the structure of how it's made and what all those pieces mean. You don't need to know those things in order to create an eBraille file, but I still think it can be helpful to have that baseline. And we'll talk about some of the implications of those features and what it means. And then we'll talk about how you can read and write eBraille files. And we'll kind of close the PowerPoint talking about, what's coming next. And then depending on time, I'll do a demo of the eBraille converter and we'll actually look at an eBraille file. I would like it if people asked questions throughout. I'll have time at the end for questions, but if you've got questions and you want to ask them, there's a Q&A button and you should be able to access that and put in your questions. And what I'll try to do is I've got this broken up into sections and I'll try to answer the questions, as I transition from one section to another. So I'll do my best to follow along with that. If it's something I'm going to cover later, I'll just say that and let you know it's coming. But I always find there are things that seem obvious to me that I forget to mention. And so if you ask a question, a lot of times it's really helpful for me because it's like, oh yeah, that's not necessarily as obvious as I thought it would be, or whatever it is. So with that, I will share my screen and we will get started. All right. So right now I have my PowerPoint up and it's eBraille, a reality for everyone. And I have the wrong date, which is fun. It's a great way to start. And then here's our agenda. So we'll do why eBraille, we'll do the process, we'll talk about what it is, and then we'll do reading and writing eBraille, what's next, additional questions, and the converter demo. So let's get started with our baseline of just why eBraille. So eBraille really started with, for us at APH at least, with the Monarch. The Monarch is a Braille and tactile graphics display created by a partnership between APH, NFB, Humanware, and DOT. And it does Braille and tactile graphics on the same surface. When we first started working on the Monarch, the very first question was how many cells per line? It's a very important question to answer when making a device like that. And I mean, the first answer is 40 cells. 40 cells is the standard in America, and it's very close to the standards of other countries. And so 40 makes a lot of sense. But with the way the Monarch is designed to do both Braille and graphics, it doesn't do it doesn't have traditional Braille spacing. So the dots are spaced evenly, equidistant, so that we can do better graphics. If we had done Braille spacing, we would have had kind of a stair step kind of graphics, like we wouldn't be able to do diagonal lines. We wouldn't be able to do anything really it would be very difficult to do things that are round or rounded. And so we did equidistant pens. And when we did equidistant pens, what it means is in order to do 40 cells of Braille, it takes the equivalent of 60 cells. It's because you need a half cell between each cell. So does that make sense? So you've got 40, but you need 60 in order to do the spacing. And I think the problem should be clear right away why we didn't do a 60 cell Braille display. But the problem that we noticed right away when we made a mock-up of that was it was huge. It wouldn't fit on a child's desk. It wouldn't fit in their backpack. It would be very heavy. And importantly, it would be even more expensive because, it's still true that the majority of the cost of a Braille display are the cells. Even though, thanks to the dot cells, we've managed to bring those costs way down, it's still the majority of the cost. So we looked and we did a study and we found that 32 cells by 10 lines was the preferred size. It was really like as big as we could get without being too big and without, increasing the cost. So we've established 32 cells by line, per line, and 10 lines per page. That is not the traditional layout. So right off the bat, using the traditional Braille file type, BRF, you would need to make your files specifically for the Monarch. So the problem then isn't just the Monarch. It's not that big of a deal for APH, for example, for us to have our contractors and transcribers make their file at 32 cells. That's not that big of a problem. But what about when this other display comes out? This other display comes out and maybe it's 25 cells, or we get additional displays with other sizes. I really believe that multi-line Braille is the future of Braille, multi-line dynamic Braille. And so we're just going to have more and more of these displays, and they're going to have different sizes for cells per line and lines per page. And as that happens, without a dynamic Braille document type, you would have to make each Braille file for those different sizes. I don't know how many folks in the audience are transcribers, but transcribers will know that when you make your Braille, you're making it to those specific cells per line and lines per page. Like it takes a lot of work to get that layout. If I make a file for 40 cells by 25, and then I change it to 32 by 10, I don't have to start over, but it's pretty close to having to start over. You have to go through the file, you have to see where maybe something changed or some mistakes were made. Well, not mistakes, but just changes that are no longer accurate. And that's time consuming and costly. And Braille already takes too long to make and already costs too much. So we didn't want to do that. And without some kind of dynamic file type, we would end up in a situation where our Braille libraries would be segregated. You know, these files are for the Monarch. These files are for that display. These files are for embossing, and on and on and on. And it would be a nightmare and it would be very costly. And so that was really the first thing, was how do we get Braille to adjust to the size of the page available? So like on the Monarch's case, that's 32 by 10, and then it's true of other displays as well. The other thing was the graphics. So the Monarch does Braille and tactile graphics. Well, with the old way of doing things, you'd have your BRF files and your, like in APH's case, PDF files for your graphics. There's nothing associating those graphics with their location in the BRF. So any student using the Monarch with these older files would really struggle to know what graphic was supposed to go where. So we needed something that was dynamic and that incorporated graphics. Very quickly, though, I do want to justify, I'm talking a lot about multi-line Braille and what's great about multi-line Braille, and I just want to share and justify why dynamic multi-line Braille. Like obviously we have multi-line Braille. We've had that on paper for a long, long time. But dynamic multi-line Braille, what's the advantage of that? And I really am excited to share some of the things we're learning with the Monarch. So some early Monarch user surveys are showing that students are more interested in reading, writing, and tactile graphics. Interest in tactile graphics has doubled. And it makes a lot of sense because before we had dynamic tactile graphics, students on average were only accessing like 13 tactile graphics a year. And now, with dynamic graphics, you can be accessing that many graphics in a day. It's just much easier. It's also gotten students more engaged, like 54% more engagement in STEM, and then 57% more engagement in non-STEM, and it's increased proficiency. And the big one that I think might interest the audience the most is it has reduced prep time. I don't know if it's the same in Canada as it is in the United States. I imagine it's the same. But in the United States, a lot of times the teacher does not get the materials out fast enough to prepare the Braille version, the accessible version, the tactile graphics, all of that. And we're already seeing that the Monarch is reducing prep time by almost 30%. And I mean, that's huge. When you're dealing with a daily problem, a 30% reduction is great over time. And I also want to say these numbers are based on just this year. So these are students that were given Monarchs, and we're sending out surveys for their parents and or teachers to report on their progress and their opinions about these topics. And so, I mean, it hasn't even been that long that the students have had the devices, and we're already seeing these big gains in these important areas. And this is, I think, going to be true of multi-line Braille generally. Obviously, I'm a fan of the Monarch. I'm on the team that helped make it. But I think generally dynamic multi-line Braille, it leads to an interactivity and an ability to self-teach that we don't necessarily see in kind of the pre-dynamic multi-line Braille world. I'll give a quick example. Like with the Monarch, you can access APH's tactile image library and pull up any one of like hundreds of graphics. That's something a student can just do on their own. They can search out topics that are interested to them and see associated graphics immediately. They don't have to hook up to an embosser, wait for it to emboss. They don't have to ask someone to help them. They're able to just do it themselves very quickly on the device using methods that are probably already familiar to them because of, the internet and other things that they're already using. So I think dynamic multi-line Braille is generally exciting and beneficial to students. And so anything we can do to make the file type support that is going to be an improvement. Now, the other question I get a lot is why Braille first? So eBraille, Braille is right there in the name. And it's a Braille first solution. And it can be a controversial decision that the group took here. Braille first, it does tie us to current processes. And we want to innovate those processes, absolutely. But the key thing is, if we had gone with a print first solution, it would have been a completely new process. It wouldn't have been an improvement on the old process. It would be, now you got to know MathML. Now you got to know how to force specific kinds of translation. In addition to that, with a print first solution, if I give student A, who has a device made by one company, and student B, who has a device made by another company, the same file, I don't actually know that they're getting the same Braille. Student A, their device might do better math translation. Student 2, maybe theirs doesn't. And that's not a great thing for school, where you've got quizzes and tests and homework and textbooks, and you need to make sure all of this is exactly the way it's supposed to be. I love automatic translation. I think computer assisted translation has come really far, but I don't think it's fair to have the child's success rest on the abilities of the software developers at a specific company. And so by having a Braille first solution, we're sticking with the professionals who have created Braille, this entire time, and trusting them to ensure the translation is accurate. And we did our best throughout the process to make sure that eBraille files, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel when it came to creating Braille. There's just too many people making Braille that we would lose if we changed that process or made it too complicated. So we really wanted to take advantage of the resources that exist right now. So that's kind of the starting point. And I'll take a moment if there's any questions, if you want to throw them in the chat before I move on to the next section.
And if the chat is difficult for anyone, you can raise your hand and we will have to ask you, select you to unmute if it is at all difficult for you.
All right, great. And so, yeah, feel free to interrupt at any time. So next I want to talk about the process. I think this is an important part of it because this really was a worldwide effort. So APH partnered with the DAISY consortium. Folks are probably familiar with DAISY, but in case you haven't heard of them, they are the Digital Accessible Information System Consortium. And their whole idea is that people have equal access to information and knowledge regardless of disability. And they've been pivotal in developing global solutions for accessible publishing and reading. And they had the international reputation that APH didn't necessarily have, since the A in APH stands for American. Our funding limits how much we're able to do outside of the United States. And Daisy they were a big influence on EPUB. They've developed a lot of tools like ACE, which is an EPUB accessibility checker. They've done Word to EPUB, the Daisy pipeline, Save as Daisy. So they already had a lot of experience in this area, and their membership already had a lot of folks that were interested in this solution and had the expertise we needed to work on it. And I mean, ultimately, we worked with 91 people representing more than 50 organizations across 16 countries. Some of the folks that you have probably heard of, so I mean, APH, NFB, BANA, Benetech, we had folks from CNIB, we had folks from Braille Literacy Canada, we had a lot of help from folks at NELS, Crawford Technologies, and internationally, we also, we had a ton of folks internationally. We had ONCE, we had RNIB, we had Humanware, Orbit Research. And these folks, it could not have been done without them. The idea was, this is going to be a lot of work. We're only going to get one shot to do this. Let's do it right. And so by getting all of these diverse opinions from Braille users, Braille standards organizations, transcribers, teachers, libraries, and companies, we were able to take into account all of those different needs, because, the needs really were varied for folks. And so it was all these different perspectives that helped us come up with a solution, I think, that will stand the test of time and can evolve with technology. So, real quick on the process of eBraille. The very first thing was defining the problem. I felt this was a really, this was Daisy. Daisy set up the process for us, but by defining the problem, we were able to ensure all of these folks agreed on what it was we were trying to solve. We didn't want to do all this work and then get to the end and have folks being like, wait, I thought we were going to do X, Y, and Z. So first we discussed what is the problem. And it was basically what I've been talking about of just, Braille not being reflowable, which leads to problems on not just the Monarch, but I mean, it leads to problems on single line displays too. Anyone that's ever read a 40 cell document on a 20 line Braille display can tell you about that problem of, you get a few words on each line, and then maybe you get one word on the line, and then you get a few words, and then one word or two. And so you're getting these long line, short line, long line, short line. And those 4 lines can all be one sentence. So in the process of reading one sentence, you're having to pan 4 times because the device, with the old Braille file isn't able to condense the lot, take advantage of the space that it does have. And so that's why you get that long line, short line problem. And I mean, that was kind of the main problem, but there were other issues we wanted to address as well, which we'll talk about. And so once we defined the problem, then we went about discussing features and changes. What is it we want this new document type to be able to do? Obviously we want it to be dynamic. We want it to include the tactile graphics and metadata. And I really liked the way this was set up because we did not start with the solution. We started with the problem. We talked about what we wanted. And then we looked at what was out there already. What were the pre-existing document types that we could use? And then we examined those. We compared them to what it was we wanted, what problem we were trying to solve. And I mean, ultimately, EPUB was the thing that got us the closest to where we wanted to be, that was able to meet our needs. And by having a pre-existing solution, so by adapting EPUB, instead of making a whole new document type, it really has done wonders for eBraille support, because you can actually make an eBraille file with any software that supports Unicode and can make EPUB. And you can open eBraille files on any EPUB reader. We'll talk about that some more, because I know not everybody has an EPUB reader, but it did make it much easier to get eBraille support, because if you support EPUB, you basically already support eBraille. So once we've done that, we adapted EPUB. We looked at what changes we need to be made. That then brought about what was probably the most complicated part of the process, which was defining all of the details and technical requirements. This was a really fascinating part of the process for me. It was very intimidating. And luckily we had Matt Garish, who's from Canada. If you look up the EPUB 3 spec, the very first author listed is Matt Garish. And as I was working on eBraille, I would look up things on EPUB and find where someone had asked a question, and then it would be answered by Matt Garish. So he's a really big deal in the EPUB world, and we could not have done eBraille without him. He understood EPUB on this, as one of the people involved in helping create it, he understood it on this much deeper level of what it was we needed to do. And he was able to really define those details and technical requirements. He called it standard speak, because there's like a particular way you have to word everything when you're developing a standard like this. So it was really great working with him. And then finally, having defined the details and technical requirements, that was then when we turned to creating and adapting software to support the standard. And that's really where we are right now, is creating and adapting software to support the standard. And we'll talk more about that as we go. It looks like we have some questions that have come in. So Mark's wondering if I can describe the Braille production process. And I mean, the Braille production process isn't going to change drastically with eBraille. So one of the pieces of software that's going to be supporting eBraille is Duxbury. So I'll just talk about Duxbury very briefly. You've got your print book, you've got your scan or your file that is based on that print book. And then you do all the changes, you add the styles, you remove and add emphasis as needed, and then you open it in Duxbury and review how that's come out and make small adjustments as needed to get it to work. That's the shortest way, I think, to describe the Braille production process, and it doesn't really change much with eBraille. The only things that really change with eBraille are being able to add links. So now you'd need to go through and add your links, and being able to put the tactile graphics in their correct location. So now you'll need to go through and say, this tactile graphic goes here and that tactile graphic goes there. That's the main change. The next one, the Monarch seems to be a K through 12 solution. As a blind professional thinking of returning to school in a STEM field, how can I get access to eBraille? That's something we're going to talk about more later, and I've kind of alluded to it already. So eBraille's based on EPUB, right? Don't actually do this, but if you have an EPUB reader, raise your hand. Most folks don't have an EPUB reader. I work in tech, and even I you struggle to find a good EPUB reader. They don't really exist. EPUB didn't quite take off in that way. So what's interesting is, like, if you own an e-reader of any kind, you're probably reading an EPUB. So if you have a Kindle or a Kobo or just a tablet, those are EPUBs. It's a variation of EPUB where they've basically added their own DRM, so digital rights management. And that's essentially what we're doing. So we're taking EPUB and making a Braille version. So knowing that there's this lack of EPUB readers, what we did is we modified EPUB, and I'll show this later, so that you can open it easily in your browser. Everyone has a browser. And so if you have access to a browser, you can read EPUB or eBraille. You can read eBraille with your browser and your Braille display via your screen reader. And when you do that, you get all the advantages of, multi-line eBraille as far as navigation, and it reflows to fit the size of your display. And because eBraille requires alt text for the tactile graphics, and alt text, for those that aren't aware, is a description of the tactile graphic or picture. And so now on your single line display, obviously you're not going to see the tactile graphic, but you'll get the alt text of the tactile graphic, so a description. And we're also looking at how the Monarch can be used for employment and college. So we actually have a program going on now where we're working with professionals across many fields, and they have Monarchs, and we're, making changes to the software and developing apps based on what they need so that we can make the Monarch more useful for people outside of K through 12. So I hope that has helped. Getting a lot of questions. I may not be able to answer them all right away, but I'll come back to them in the next section if I don't get to them all. Do you see applicability of eBraille in the workplace? How might a Braille reading professional working today might access this format? And that kind of goes back to what I was just saying, but what I'll add very quickly. So eBraille is a Braille first standard, right? We did that for its precision. And precision is very important in school, particularly, because you don't know enough to know when there's a mistake, right? So if you're an adult, maybe you don't always need eBraille. Maybe an EPUB, which is a print document type, is good enough because it's a novel, or because it's just a professional periodical or something that you're reading. And so what I like about eBraille is eBraille does meet its need, and it doesn't preclude anyone from using other options, from still using BRF, if that's what they prefer, from using an automatically translated EPUB. The other great thing about eBraille is, and I'll talk about this more later, you're going to hear that a lot, is the formatting of eBraille can be applied to an EPUB. It's a little technical, so I'll save it for later once we understand a little more of how all that works. But the changes we did for eBraille can actually make accessible EPUBs better. All right, the next one. Can eBraille be embossed on paper? And mentions music Braille. Yeah, music Braille is complicated, and it's one of the things we're going to be working on in 2026 is music Braille for eBraille. And embossing is also complicated. But the great thing is, when you emboss, you do so via software. So you're embossing via Braille Blaster, Duxbury, Tiger Software Suite. And so that process isn't really going to change. The thing about eBraille is you have to lay out the page. And so the software will need to lay out the page, and then you'll be able to emboss it. And Duxbury and Braille Blaster and other mediums via one would interact with an embosser will be able to handle that. No current embosser will emboss eBraille on its own, but that will probably change over time. Does one line display have any relevance with eBraille, or is it meant for multi-line only? As I was saying, like, one line displays will still benefit from eBraille, just from having reflowable content, being able to jump via headings and page numbers, getting that alt text. So it can still benefit the single line displays. All right. So the next question is about converting files, which I'm going to talk about later. And then as far as the actual process of creating eBraille, I'm going to talk about that later as well. And then the next one's a very nice thing to say. And then a question about how tactile graphics are created. Tactile graphics, the process of creating tactile graphics isn't going to change, but we'll talk about that some more later when we get to that section. All right. So what is it? We've talked, we've kind of talked around what eBraille is, and I want to make sure folks really know the structure and what it is we're talking about. And this will get a little technical, but I really think I've got it set up in a way that makes it very digestible. All right, so overall description. So, I mean, its basic form, it's a new digital format designed specifically for Braille. So that's the easiest answer. But then its main goal is to combine the flexibility of ebooks with the precision of Braille rules to work across multiple devices, and then as a way to future-proof ways to read, write, and share Braille. The really great thing about eBraille is the way it's created. Now, we put a lot of thought into how eBraille is created. So the structure of the actual document. And you don't get anything guaranteed because of that structure. So it's not like the features exist just because we made them possible. But that structure really does make a ton of features possible that weren't possible before, like the ability to add notes and highlighting and remote updates and lots of things that could never be done before. Better, just better interactivity generally. And so that's the base. That was stuff that they really, the software developers of reading systems couldn't do before. And so now they have the ability, and we're going to see over time as different software developers, this Braille display company, that Braille display company, take advantage of these features. And I think we're just going to see Braille improve, like Braille interactivity especially, improve over time. One of the easiest ways to talk about eBraille is to talk about its differences with the old file type, BRF. So let's run through that. Number one uses Unicode instead of ASCII. So if you're not familiar with these terms, ASCII, think of that as the keys on your keyboard. So you're making Braille using just the keys on your keyboard. There are no Braille keys on your keyboard. Like there's no key for the ED contraction, for example. And so what ASCII does is it uses, like for the ED symbol, it'll use the $sign. There's, the .4 is I think it's the @ symbol. And so all of these symbols on your keyboard then get translated into Braille characters. And you need a font in order to see that. So if you don't have a Braille font, the ASCII will just look like ASCII. And it takes it takes time to be able to read ASCII, and it's not a skill anyone's ever impressed with. But Unicode is actual Braille characters. So Unicode, if you're not familiar with Unicode, emojis are Unicode. So the smiley face, the smiley laughing face, those are all Unicode. Within Unicode are all possible Braille configurations. And the great thing about it is you don't need a font. So you don't get those miscommunications. It's also an international standard. The A in ASCII stands for American. And while some other countries use ASCII, not everyone does. And you can actually get BRFs that are made with different encodings. ASCII's an encoding. So I actually got a BRF from a person in Spain, and we're talking about the issues they're seeing in their BRF, but we're not agreeing on what we're seeing. I'm seeing different Braille than them. And it turned out my machine was viewing it as ASCII, when in reality, they were using a completely different encoding. With Unicode, that problem goes away. Now we're sure everybody's seeing the same thing. It also uses markup instead of blank space. Markup, and we're going to talk about this more, but it's the structure. It basically says this is a paragraph, this is a heading. In a BRF, there's no such thing as a paragraph. It looks like a paragraph, but it's a lie. It's actually just some lines that are next to each other, and one of them happens to have two blank spaces in front of it. There's nothing in the file that says line 2 is related to line 1. That's why you get those long line, short line problems. The software has no way to know that line 2 goes with line 1. They're just disconnected. With markup, they're connected. It's saying everything within these two tags is a paragraph. It includes links. So with that, you're able to jump around your file much more easily. And then it also has dynamic formatting, which we've talked about quite a lot. And then the other piece it has is metadata. BRF doesn't have any metadata. All you have is the title of the file. And a lot of times that file is just, volume 1 or volume 2 or whatever. With metadata, you're able to say the title, the author, the publisher, the publication date, the day it was transcribed. You're able to get all this information that can then help you organize your files. And one thing I'll tell you, I was for a long time the product manager of the Mantis and the Chameleon. We would get bugs reported from the field of folks that had 1,000 books on their Mantis. And when you have 1,000 books, it was when you turned on your Mantis and it loaded the reader, it would also load those 1,000 files. And it did it relatively quickly for being 1,000 files, but we had to change how we started up because people love having their whole library on their device. And so metadata would make those 1,000 files much easier to cycle through and sort through just as a user. And then last, it bundles graphics, which we've talked about, and we'll talk about a little more when we get there. See, we've got some questions. Oh, wants to know what K through 12 means. So that's an American term for kindergarten through 12th grade, which is what we would call just, the normal school that's required by law, typically. Sorry about that. I get in trouble all the time because I use local expressions. So sorry about that. All right, so the pieces of eBraille. The main piece at the bottom is HTML, which is the structure of the file. You can think of it as the skeleton, and it organizes all the content, paragraphs, headings, lists, tables, and it makes sure the Braille display knows where they belong. It allows the user to jump to those locations. You can jump to a specific heading or page number, and it's also what allows us to add links to Braille files. Links are great. And one of the things I love about the ability to have links in eBraille files is footnotes. The Braille Authority of North America, I love them. They're great. I love our Braille rules. One of the rules that's a bit complicated are footnotes. So when you have a footnote, you've got your little symbol that tells you there's a footnote, and then the associated text appears at the end of the print page. In print, that system works because one print page is one print page. In Braille, it works, but it's more complicated because one print page could be 5 Braille pages, it could be 10 Braille pages. You don't know. And so you find your footnote, and then the associated text, you don't really know how far away it's going to be. Now with links, you could have that footnote be a link. You could click it and then jump straight to that footnote, read it, and then jump right back to the text. And then if you're not too familiar with HTML, the main thing to know is it's how websites are structured. And it's the building block of eBraille, it's the building block of the web. And HTML wouldn't do much without CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, which is a name that I vaguely understand why they called it that, but it's not a great name. But those are the styling rules. And it's like a style guide for eBraille. So the HTML's telling us this is a heading. It's the CSS that says this heading should be centered. This heading should have a blank before and after. This table should be structured in this specific way. And it's what ensures Braille formatting is consistent across devices. And this is at the heart of what eBraille is. Because what we've done with eBraille is we've separated the content from the presentation. So the content is the Braille itself. The presentation is how that Braille is, shown. So as centered headings and as paragraphs that are, starting in cell 3 and running over to cell 1, and with lists that start in cell 1 and run over to cell 3. So we've separated those things. And one of the great things that comes about because of this, so like, for example, we have UEB, Unified English Braille. We're finally in the English-speaking world using one Braille code, technically. But we're all using different formatting rules. So the US and Canada, we use BANA rules. The UK has their own rules. South Africa has their own rules. Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, all have these different rules. Well, with CSS, you could have a cascading style sheet for BANA, CSS for the UK, CSS for Australia, and now you could share that UEB file, and you already understand the Braille, but now you'll also understand the formatting. So you'll see the same formatting that you're used to, regardless of where the Braille was created. That's a feature that'll need to be supported by the reading software, but I think it's really cool that it's possible. It means it'll be easier to share Braille across these different Braille regions, especially where we share a code like we do with UEB. Next up is metadata. This is data about the book. We've talked about it a little bit already, but it's like a name tag for the file. So it helps libraries, schools, and users identify and organize their Braille files. It'll make it easier to search, share, and keep collections accessible. And then finally, we have graphics. So, there were some questions about how graphics will be created for eBraille. The process of creating graphics isn't really going to change, but there are some implications because of eBraille. So we can include tactile graphics, and we had to limit it. So we limited it to the file types that EPUB already supported, which were JPEG and PNG, which are both traditional image file types. They're not great for tactile graphics because you can't put text in them. And then they're also not scalable. So as you zoom in on them, they actually get blurry. They don't maintain their crispness as you zoom in. So they're not great as a dynamic graphic file type, but they are used throughout the world. And as we said, we didn't want to change the process entirely. So we've kept JPEG and PNG because that's used around the world. PDF's also not great. We use PDF at APH. And for a long time, it was the best of a lot of imperfect solutions. The problem with PDF is it can be scalable, but it can also not be scalable. And you don't know if it's scalable until you open it. And it can have text in it, but it can also have pictures of text in it. And again, you don't know until you open it. And the other problem with PDF, the D in PDF stands for document. It's not even a picture type. It is a document type that we use for pictures because it is a very image-based document type. So it makes sense why we did that. But PDF is not perfect. So we've got JPEG, PNG, PDF. Those are all already used. They all have their use cases and their downsides. But then we also have SVG. People are starting to use SVG more and more for tactile graphics. It stands for Scalable Vector Graphics. And I think it will be the future of tactile graphics. It'll take time to get there, but there's number one, they're scalable. As you zoom in on them, they maintain their crispness. You can have text in them. They can be modified to fit the size of the page. And one of the best things about SVG is you can write an SVG. So it's basically like coding. You can use text to create an SVG, which makes them more accessible than other image-based file types where you can only draw them. And so by having these different file types, with the SVG, with the Unicode, we're not just trying to solve problems and meet needs. We're also trying to like gently push the field forward and say, hey, here's this other file type that we could be working with that maybe meets our needs a bit better. And so, this isn't going to be overnight, but I think over time, we're going to see more and more folks making tactile graphics using SVG. And we've got them in their specific location. We've got the alt text, and everything's bundled together. Before you had your BRFs in one folder, your PDFs in another folder, and it's just a bunch of disparate files, and it starts to be a nightmare keeping them all together. Well, with eBraille, you have all that same stuff. You have all those Braille files, you have all those image files but they're now stored in one bundle. So one eBraille file contains all the old, basically contains all the same kind of things as the old stuff, where it was all spread out across a bunch of different other files. This will make a little more sense when we look at an eBraille later. So we might come back to that. Just some questions. Marie points out that eBraille has potential to make foreign language learning more accessible and dynamic. I agree with that. Part of it is because we can identify which parts are in what language. So when you make a code change or a language change, there's tags in the eBraille file telling the reading software, this is French, this is UEB, this is Nemeth, whatever it is. And, the more information that's available to the software, the more features that you can have in the reading software. So it just opens up the possibilities for better reading software over time. So why do these parts matter? So HTML is giving the book its structure. CSS is applying the Braille formatting rules. Metadata is the book's identity. And then the graphics are making it easier to access and improves consistency and storage of files. So it's all these parts together that make an eBraille. It's what makes it complete, consistent, and accessible. But what does that mean practically? So practically, it means it works on single line displays, as we've discussed, multi-line devices, and the potential to work on embossers. As we discussed, embossers will require some kind of software to interpret the file, but that doesn't preclude the ability to actually emboss eBraille files. We'll probably have a state where BRFs tend to be used for embossing, eBraille tends to be used for dynamic, but I think over time, as embossers have new changes and developments, I think we'll see more and more embossers supporting eBraille. We've got the markup making books easier to navigate, tactile diagrams for easier access, the metadata improving the organization, and then we built it on EPUB. So as changes happen in the print world, we won't need to reconvene and completely recreate, like eBraille 2 or whatever. Instead, we'll automatically pick up some changes from EPUB and we'll benefit from those features. And if we do need to discuss additions to eBraille, it won't be this big complicated process. It'll be much easier to just add those features to the specification. One feature that I'm super excited about is corrections and new additions will be easier to distribute. So we talked about the Braille production process earlier. Well, there's a big part of that process of proofreading that I didn't get into. So the transcriber makes the Braille. The transcriber turns in the Braille to whatever editor they're working with. The Braille gets proofread. Issues get sent back to the transcriber. The transcriber makes those changes. They send it back in. It gets proofread again. It gets sent back to the transcriber. The transcriber makes those changes. We give it one more look of quality assurance, and then we send it out to the student. That's a very time-consuming process. And it's, it's important, especially when you're embossing Braille, you need this Braille to last. You want it to be good. And wanting the Braille to be good isn't going to change. But what does change is that we can just update the file. So, we all know that students are still not getting their books necessarily on the first day of class. And, that still happens. Well, now, if the transcriber's finished the book and we just need to do the proofreading phase, let's go ahead and send out the book. It would be better to get that Braille and then we can proofread it and then we can update it and make it perfect rather than the student not having the Braille. That was previously not possible because, it's just not feasible to emboss and add a spine and all the other things to a book, send it out, and then to do that again, so you've already doubled the cost. Do that again once you've proofread it, and then do it a third time after you've proofread it again. That's just not feasible. Well, now we can be proofreading and making adjustments, and the student is never losing progress, never losing their place in the book or their bookmarks or their notes or whatever. So I think that's probably the most exciting thing, and it's going to be the thing that really helps printing houses like APH and transcribers everywhere meet the needs of students quicker. Yeah, and get them their books on the first day of class. And then, as we talked about, the formatting can be updated to match the user's expectations. And this goes a couple ways. So, I talked about sharing Braille across Braille regions. Another example, too, though, is personal taste. Gary Mudd, who some of you may know, was a vice president at APH. He's since retired. But he liked his Braille as a nested list. He didn't want headings. He didn't want paragraphs. He just wanted a nested list. He read a lot. He read all the time, very busy, and that's what he found most easy. Well, with eBraille, there actually is a way that he could have his books show up as nested lists without having to ask someone to make them that way for him. And so it really does empower the user in this whole new way. The tools to make that possible still need to be created, but the tools to make that easy still need to be created. You can technically do it without any tools or with existing tools, but most folks aren't going to want to. But the fact that we're close to even being able to do it at all, I think is a great thing. All right. About to get into the last couple of sections, which are pretty short. How difficult is it to add graphic file formats in the future to the eBraille standard? The way these standards are created is very formal. So there is a process we would have to follow to add, to make those kinds of fundamental changes. But it's not impossible, and it won't be nearly as much work as it was to write the initial specification. It would be, weeks of work rather than years of work. But it's not like I can't just go in and say, now we support this file type. I can't just unilaterally do that. You have to do it with individuals that are, a part of the working group. Which is, I think, the right way to do it, even if it is a little more time consuming. When you spoke about being able to update the Braille files, is that as simple as a teacher or student informing them of the error or an update that's required? So that's not how it's going to work off the bat. At the start, it'll probably be controlled by whoever created the file. They'll send it out, they'll make their changes because it will require cooperation between the company that made the reading software and the company that's making the file. Like they'll have to be speaking the same language and understanding each other. But I don't know how far we are from a future like what you're suggesting. Like I think that is a possibility. But it'll probably be controlled by the publishers, like APH, the Braille publishers, uh, at first. And again, this feature does not exist at the moment, but it's something we couldn't do before and can do now. And I'm the product manager for the Monarch now, so I'm very keen to make the Monarch do that. Um, but with the old file, like I said, there's no paragraphs. It's just some lines in a trench coat pretending to be a paragraph. And so if there's a problem with one of those lines and I make a change, well, now that line's too long. So now I got to pull that word down to the next line. And now that line's too long. And you've got this cascading set of problems, all because you added one word. With eBraille, that doesn't happen. Because we've got the tags, I can add one word, I can remove a word, I can make changes, I can fix contractions, I can do whatever. And that tag is that item is indexed so that I can change it and not alter the rest of the file. I'm not going to act like it's an easy thing to do, but before it was basically impossible. And now it is possible, and it'll require a little ingenuity on the software development side to make it work. All right. Thank you all so much for the questions.
I'm
about,
sorry, Willow.
yeah.
I'm not able to put it my question in the Q&A because I'm a panelist, but you mentioned notes, and I was just a little bit confused. Would I be able to make notes within the eBraille file, like within my book, like a student could write in the margins? Are we able to do that with eBraille? I wasn't 100% sure about
Thanks.
that.
Yeah. I'm glad you asked for clarification so I can make it clear what I meant there. Um, so yeah, with the old file, you've got your fake paragraph. If you made a note and associated it with that paragraph, basically what ends up happening is in the background somewhere, there's a file that says this note goes here. Well, if here is no longer where it was, that note may no longer be in the correct location. And it's because of that kind of like nebulous nature of the formatting of the BRF file. And I've talked a lot of smack about BRF. I want to say that BRF is great. BRF did what it was supposed to do, which was be lightweight, be predictable, be consistent, and be easy to create. So I do love BRF. But then with eBraille, because of the tagging, just like with those edits that I talked about, you could associate your note as the reader with that specific item. And then no matter what changes happen, even if we drastically change that item, your note would still be in the correct location. And so you could have your book, you could read your book, you could add notes as you're reading, and then an update happens. You get changes and corrections added to your book. Your notes won't be affected. Basically, the way notes are done right now, like let's say you've put notes in your BRF. If I need to send you a new BRF, your notes are all going to go away because you can't really edit a BRF. All I could do is send you a new BRF, and that new BRF isn't going to have any of the associations of your old BRF. So yeah, what I'm saying is that eBraille makes it possible to have your own notes and highlights on that book. It's just like what you can do with a print e-reader. Like I love ebooks. I'm sighted, I'm a print reader, and I love ebooks and I love highlighting in my books. Well, those books get updates. They get updates all the time. You just don't see them because they're so small. And, to fix typos and mistakes and things like that, your notes are never affected. Your highlighting is never affected. We'll be able to do the same thing with eBraille. So I've talked a lot. I've gotten very technical. A very important question that I get all the time. Do I need to learn to code? The answer is no. Okay. So we talked about HTML. We talked about CSS. We talked about links. You don't have to know these things to make eBraille. I think it's useful to talk about these things because of how they help you understand why eBraille's made the way it is and what's possible with eBraille. But you're never going to have to write a line of HTML. You're never going to have to learn how to make a cascading style sheet. When you make eBraille, you'll use the software that you've always used. So Duxbury right now is working on a save to eBraille feature. Duxbury has been a great help in the process of making eBraille. Very early on, when we were talking about International Braille, it was David Holliday who worked with the eBraille working group, and he knew so much more about International Braille than anyone. And he worked for Duxbury. One of my favorite things that I learned from him is around the world, Braille always goes left to right. So even if your print language goes right to left, your Braille goes left to right. And the reason is obvious. Once I learned it, it was like, oh, of course. It's because of embossers and braillers and Braille displays. They go left to right. And so the system, was just adopted that way. But they're working on a save to eBraille feature. That should be coming out before the end of the year. Braille Blaster, we're also working on eBraille support, and that should also be done before the end of the year. So we'd hope, excuse me, we had hoped to have this out before the end of the year. We'd hope to have it out over the summer, but we will have it by the end of the year. And having support of Duxbury is great because when not only do they know a lot about International Braille, they're also one of the most popular, I think they are the most popular Braille transcription tool in the world. And it's because of all their language support. So having them support eBraille is great. So we've got Duxbury coming, we got Braille Blaster coming. I don't know if you're familiar with Sao Mai Braille, SAOMAI Braille. They're out of Vietnam, and it's a free Braille transcription software that's very good. And they're going to be adding support for eBraille, but I don't know their timeline specifically. I get asked all the time about Braille 2000. We've reached out to them. We've not had much luck getting eBraille support in Braille 2000. But I'm hopeful that as eBraille continues to become more popular, that we'll be able to get it added to Braille 2000. But we also have APH's BRF to eBraille converter, which I'll be showing you here in a little bit. And so if you're using Braille 2000, or if you have an old file and you want to view it as an eBraille file, you'll be able to use this converter to do so. We also have the DAISY pipeline. So the DAISY pipeline, you can do EPUB, Word, XML, and then automatically convert that to BRF, eBraille, and lots of other file types. So that's also available right now. Now, as far as reading eBraille, the Monarch is the first multi-line display to support it. We have additional updates that are going to be coming in October. That's our 1.4 update. And then we're also going to be adding support to the Mantis and the Chameleon. And we were asked about this earlier of, how can just any display access eBraille? And it's with your browser and a screen reader, which I'll also demonstrate before we wrap up today. And, it's going to take some time, but we're going to see more displays support eBraille as we go. And I'm grateful for how we set it up. It was Daisy specifically that suggested that we have this route to use the browser as well. And because of that, the support of being able to view it in the browser, you could take a Refresher Braille 18, for example, which is APH's display, which has been we stopped selling it like, I don't know, almost 10 years ago. And it hasn't had any updates in that time. You could view an eBraille with a Refresher Braille 18. So if you can connect your Braille display to JAWS, to NVDA, to VoiceOver, you'd be able to access eBraille via that screen reader. And yeah, we just hope to get more support over time. And then real quick, we'll close up the PowerPoint section with what's coming next. So we got a question about Music Braille. Music Braille, I finally basically understand Music Braille thanks to James Bowden. I don't know how many folks know James. He's out of the UK with RNIB, but someone finally explained Music Braille to me in a way that I was able to understand. And it is complicated because of the way the right hand and the left hand and each line needs to be lined up together. But I do think a solution is possible. And so one of the things we're going to be looking at in the next year is how we can make recommendations for Music Braille so that you can have all the benefits of a static Music Braille file in a dynamic format. We're also going to be looking at the challenges and requirements of what's called dual rendition files. This is something folks in especially Northern Europe really want. So this would allow you to package your Braille and the print and potentially even the audio in one package. So you'd have one file, and inside you'd have the Braille, the print, and the audio. It's not going to be easy. It won't be easy to create, and it won't be easy to read. And so we're going to be looking at it. We're going to be seeing what's involved. We're going to be making recommendations. And then we'll be working with software developers to see, what's possible here. But I know it's important to a lot of folks, especially in Europe. And so we want to make sure we examine it and see what's possible here. Dual renditions are possible with EPUB today, but the truth of the matter is they're so complicated that nobody does them. It's not really been taken advantage of. And eBraille may be the thing that, because it is so useful, it may be that we end up being able to justify these challenges or finding a way to make them easier. But we'll see. That's what this is going to be, is exploring this question. We're also going to be developing software to make it easier to read eBraille files, especially with older displays, and then advocating for more support in hardware and software, especially embossing, and then continuing to refine, the formatting, the CSS, and the other aspects of eBraille as we get more feedback from folks. A lot of really smart people around the world made this standard, and we have some data of what it looks like when it's actually used by people, but we don't have enough data. And so we're going to be getting more data and then refining the standard as we get that feedback. So that's the PowerPoint. I've got about 15 minutes. Luckily, the demo does not take that long because the program is pretty simple to use. Got a comment about Daisy. Do you know if the eBraille update for Duxbury will just be a software update or will it require that? I don't know. I'm hopeful that it's just a software update, but I've tried to respect, since we're like different companies and we make a competing product. I haven't I've avoided asking Peter how they're gonna do this. I'm really hopeful it's a free software update, but I don't know, unfortunately. Question about music. Could you actually represent the print music? This actually came up recently in a customer service question. So you could represent the actual print music, but the 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 notes would be so big that it wouldn't be practical. Like the notes would be so large to make tactographic versions of the print notes. They'd be so big you could only see a few of them at a time, and it wouldn't be very practical. Um, I think maybe one day we might be able to do something like that, but it's going to require a device with like just thousands and thousands of tiny pins, not even Braille dots, like literally pins. But we're a long way away from that. All right. I think I got everybody's question. If I didn't get your question, please put it in the chat and I'll try to circle back. Oh yeah, we could do the music on as tactographics for the Monarch. That we definitely could do. All right, I'm gonna end my slideshow. And now we're gonna look at the converter. So I've got the converter right here. It's just a folder. Inside that folder is the program itself, convert to eBraille. I'm gonna run the program. And right when it comes up, you get a little note, not for production use. This is not a production ready build and is only for testing purposes. No other use is recommended and is at the user's own risk. The whole idea here is the converter is going to be coming out soon, but we didn't want anyone. We have people testing the converter for us. We have a lot of testers, actually. We didn't want them converting their whole library and then us making changes and them having to convert their whole library again. So we just wanted to make sure folks knew, don't do that. We're still developing. But I go ahead and hit OK. And now I'm actually in the converter. At the very top is a help menu. Later, that'll have the documentation. Right now, it's just a way to check for updates. Below that, we have the conversion profiles. These profiles are related to the page settings tab, which I'm going to be talking about in a little bit. So I'll circle back to that. And then we've got these three tabs, the general tab, the page settings tab, and the metadata tab. So I'll run through each of those, and then I'll show you the converter in action. So the general tab, that's where you point us to your book. So you've got the input type, so list of BRF, directory of BRF. This is basically you're pointing us to one BRF if it's a list, or a handful of BRFs, or you're pointing us to an entire folder of BRFs. Most of the time, you're probably going to want directory of BRF. So like if you've got all your volumes in one folder, you'd point us to that folder. Below that is where you tell us where your BRFs are. So I'm going to go ahead and find some BRFs. I'm going to pick one at random, which has gotten me into trouble in the past, but that's life. The next thing is an include images text box. If this is unchecked, you have no images. If you do have images, you go ahead and check it. And once you check it, you then have your image directory, which is the same as where you told us where your BRFs were. Now you're going to tell us where your, in this case, PDFs are. So I'm pointing it at the PDF folder through the Windows File Explorer. So I've now told it where my BRFs are. I've told it where my PDFs are. And then the last step on the general tab is to tell us where to put it. So I'm just going to put mine on the desktop and I'll call it the BLC example. And I'm going to click save. And so now it's going to output that on my desktop when I click this convert button, but I'm not going to click the convert button yet. I want to run through the other tabs. So we got the page settings tab. So the page setting, it's asking you to give us some information about the file. We can guess this information. And in a future update, we are going to go ahead and guess. But if we make a mistake, it will mess up your converted file. So in this version, we ask you to tell us, just tell us. Because if you get this right, the rest of the conversion kind of rests on this information. So has running heads. Does your file have a running head? The number of cells per line and lines per page. Those are text boxes. Right now they're set for 40 and 25. And then the locations of your even and odd Braille page numbers and your even and odd print page numbers. Right now, those are bottom for odd Braille, bottom right, none for even Braille, and then the odd print and even print are in the top right. All that's adjustable. You probably won't have to mess with this too much since our formatting rules are basically the same. But if you do, so we've got these conversion profiles. So by default, it'll come with APH interpoint and APH single-sided. The only difference between those two is where the even Braille page numbers are. But you can also make your own. Like I've made one here called 38 cells. So for cells per line, instead of 40, it has 38 cells. But you can make whatever, within these parameters, you can do whatever you want. And then there's this button next to the conversion profiles that lets you save a profile, delete a profile, or reset your profiles. If you reset, it takes you back to only having the two default profiles. Resetting could be useful if you delete the default profiles and you want to bring them back, but that's what that's for. So ideally, you'd be setting up your page settings once and then doing your conversions, because probably your books are probably converted the same or formatted the same way. But if they're not, this is where you would make those changes. The last tab is the metadata tab. The metadata tab is my least favorite tab, and it's because it can be kind of time consuming to fill it out. The whole process of actually doing a conversion, it should take even for a very large book, like a normal sized book, it'll happen almost instantaneously. A book with a lot of tactile graphics will take, up to like a minute, which is still pretty fast when you consider all the information it's dealing with. But the metadata section is going to be the most time consuming part because you're going to put in the title, you're going to put in the creator, the producer, and that information isn't going to necessarily carry over from book to book. So you'd have to do it again each time you do a conversion. I don't love that. One of the things we're going to be looking at in a future update is letting you point to an existing resource like the Louis database from APH, or I'm sure Nels has this kind of information available for some of their books. So being able to point to a location that has this information already, and then we'll be able to pull the information from there. You won't be able to just point to any source, but what we'll do is we'll set up some sources that we know we can work with and let folks choose. And then if we find your book at the one of those resources, we'll pull the information from there. And that'll really speed it up. But for now, you just got to fill it out manually. All right. So we've talked about the tabs, we've talked about the profiles, talked about help. I'm now going to convert. I click the convert button and it starts doing the conversion. So this is a big book. I picked it at random, I really did, and it is taking it a little longer than usual. We've gotten up to 99%, and I don't know if you know this. If you don't work in tech, you probably don't. Progress bars are just really good guesses. They don't actually know where you are in the process. They're just doing their best to guess. But that was still relatively fast for what I'm assuming is a big book. And now one thing to note is this is a .zip instead of a .ebrl. When we release this in October, it'll say .ebrl, but it's just easier for me to show it to you if it's a .zip. So right now I'm unzipping the file. So I've unzipped it. And at the end of the day, an eBraille is just a zipped folder with the file extension .ebrl. Like you could change the file extension from .ebrl to .zip to get to where I am right now. You can do the same thing with an EPUB. You can change the file ending of an EPUB from .epub to .zip and then you can extract it like I just did. But by extracting it, we're able to look at the parts. So we've got, here in the root, we've got the index.html. That's going to be probably the most important part because I can open this in my browser. I'll go ahead and use Chrome. And that's the entire book. So this is all the headings in this book. This is a table of contents that was generated by the converter. We know where all your headings are, and we know the structure of your headings because we converted your book. And so now we're able to make this list. And so now you can click on any part of this and it will jump you to that part of the book. Now, I've clicked on a part and I'm looking at the book. Now you're going to notice some things that do look strange. For example, the headings, the Braille is bigger than like the paragraphs. That is a side effect of using a browser. If you're using a Braille display, all the Braille is going to be the same size. This visual indication has been helpful for us with our testing, and it doesn't impact the user, but it is one of the side effects of using the browser. But so don't worry too much about how it looks visually. The main thing will be how it looks when you open it on like a Monarch or whatever. But we also have our tactile graphics embedded in the file. It looks really tiny, but again, this is just a side effect of using the browser. On the Monarch, you'd go straight from Braille, and then you'd be able to jump into a full page of your tactile graphic and then jump back to the Braille. But that gives you an idea of how it works. And I've got just a few minutes left. I'll jump in here. I'm in the eBraille folder within the example, and here's all of our volumes. So this is an 8-volume book. Each volume is a separate HTML file. And then the CSS is always the same. That's in this CSS folder. And then we've got our images. So this is 440 tactile graphics. They've all been split out into individual PDFs. They've all been put in their correct location. We do that using the print page numbers, since there's print page numbers in both the PDF and the BRF. And we even split up the PDF because each volume was one PDF, and now we've split it up to where they're all individual files. But at the end of the day, there's a whole lot in here. And it's going to be useful for users. So readers of Braille are going to benefit from this information. The people who develop the software that we use to read Braille, they're going to be able to make cooler features. And like the craziest thing for me is, as a transcriber, when I first started, 13 years ago, I'm adding all this information. I'm taking a chaotic scan or whatever and turning it into a formatted Braille file. Well, when I would save it as a BRF, all that information got thrown out. All we're doing is we're saying, don't throw that out. Let's keep it because we can use it. And that's what we're doing now with eBraille. Thank you all so much for the opportunity to be here. If you had questions and I wasn't able to get to them, I'm really sorry. My email address is wfree, so WFREE @aph.org. So please feel free to email me your questions and I'll do my best to get back to you soon. But yeah,
Wow.
thank you for letting me present.
So amazing, Willow. Thank you so much for that. I'm just so excited as a Braille reader to get into
Awesome.
eBraille. I'm sure a lot of other people are for all your various reasons. I want to thank everybody for their wonderful questions. And also, just so everyone knows, this has been recorded. We always make a transcript for anyone who is not able to hear or needs to experience that in a different way, prefers to read the transcript. Because we're all volunteers, it takes us a little while to clean up the transcript, and we don't release the recording until we have also a transcript to go along with it. So we will do so and let people know when it goes up onto our site. Daphne, did you have anything else to say before we close up.
Thanks, Kim. Thank you, Willow, for an amazing presentation and answering questions and giving us a taste of eBraille and eBraille in the future. That's really impactful. Check back to our website, www.brailleliteracycanada.ca, and as Kim says, the audio and transcript will be up in the next couple of months for sure. If you have any questions about this information, you can get in touch with us at info@blc-lbc.ca, or look us up on the web. Thank you, Willow. Thank you, Kim. And thank you, participants, for joining us today.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah. Bye now.